So I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between philosophy and a philosophical system or scheme and reality or experience, and how we compare different schemes or systems or ways of interpreting experience, because it seems like the very criteria to determine whether a scheme is adequate to experience come from within a particular scheme.
Yes.
And so it's almost like...
Or a context.
You need a meta scheme or a... Yeah, like how do you step outside of a particular framework so as to gauge the extent to which, on some level of meta-analysis or verification, you can tell whether it's doing better or worse. It seems like you can only do that from within a particular scheme. So when we start to go beyond just abstract philosophical schemes or systems into the transformation of experience, or we understand philosophy itself as a transformation, a way of instigating transformation in experience, that seems to me to sort of reconfigure the whole issue, because you're not trying to represent a pre-given reality anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like the ideal should be it should arise out of this aspiration to bring the context, the historical cultural context, into reflexive articulation, and then like whatever you come up with be a response to that, but one that's also open to the future and in continuity with the past, though it might be a transformation of it. So just the willingness to like recognize the provisional character of the articulation.
Right, the articulation's provisional, but once you've articulated it, it has interfered with or in some way changed,
so it advances it.
What you thought was given, right? There's no way to just describe what's given. The very act of description generates its own sort of set of facts. Like, you don't have facts and then interpret them. The interpretive scheme is what solicits facts, certain sorts of facts, as salient or not. An interpretive scheme pulls facts out of an indeterminate background of indefinite chaos, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think this participatory notion of thinking as a part and parcel of the world process itself, rather than thinking as an attempt to represent that process from a vantage beyond it.
Well, and also in a kind of reified setup, like as if it's not a historical process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just a fixed relation, temporally.
And as part of this is how we think about the relationship between philosophy and common sense or everyday experience, or like the cultural given in any historical moment. Some would say philosophy is supposed to, maybe a post-axial age philosophy is supposed to step outside of that historical cultural conditioning and perceive the truth. Like, I think the metaphor of the cave is different, but the idea would be like when you're historically situated, you're chained facing a wall of shadows, and philosophy is the path beyond the shadows on the wall into a kind of perspective from eternity. But I think Plato's deeper than that because of this doctrine of participation, where the idea is not to escape the images, the shadows, but to become the architect of your own imagination or imaginations, to become an artist of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than read philosophy as like trying to extricate itself from either the cultural given or some pre-given experiential or empirical domain. Philosophy is more like a way of freely entering into relationship with experience and becoming conscious of the way experience itself is constructed, and taking part in that constructive activity
consciously
with responsibility, and not just passive acceptance of what you think is given.
Yeah, I don't think she would necessarily, I'm not sure if she would go as far metaphysically speaking into the kind of Platonic participatory perspective, but Donna Haraway's understanding of, objectivity as situated, that's the only way you really can become objective, is if you really become conscious of and recognize your situatedness. That's the only, you have to go through that before you can get to any kind of trans-historical insight, as you were saying.
Yeah. But are we claiming, if we're participatory, a trans-historical insight or a meta-historical insight?
Yeah, I guess I kind of think of them as almost synonymous.
I mean, I guess to the extent that history is just a set of circumstances that determine and shape us, participatory philosophy would be not being determined by that, but self-determining in a way. So you're not so much transcending as...
I just think there's a transcendent dimension to it that is the condition that enables any kind of awareness of participation and metamorphosis. Not that you get a view from nowhere and you have a kind of absolute omniscience of everything in the whole future of the process or anything like that, but just to get the insight that there's a metamorphosis that's unfolding, and to be conscious of being a part of it, freedom, transcendence in relation to that freedom that allows for that awareness to arise.
Yeah. It seems to me like a both and, include as you transcend type of movement, because we want to not just leave history behind.
Well, transcendence, even just in my opinion, at least, understood this way, just if it weren't being related back to context, then it has no meaning.
Right. Yeah, it's unfortunate that transcendence has taken this negative connotation in, I guess, modernity as such. Everyone's so focused on immanence.
Yeah. The immanent frame. Well, that's not how people who are trying to...
But there are overly...
immanentisms.
But the problem is that people who resist the immanence often impose this more abstract kind of transcendence that is a...
Well, it's a counterfeit.
Yeah.
It's ideology.
Right. And so how do we recover some sense of concrete transcendence?
I think it's interpersonally is a really important place for that to be exercised, which is really one expression of it is not to judge others. I think it's yeah.
So there's a...
Which is... Go ahead.
Well, it strikes me that there's an ethical dimension right at the core of metaphysics, in that sense that your capacity to know the real is bound up with your capacity to love one another, and to be able to dialogue with others. Like, language puts us outside of ourselves always already in dialogue with a history of interpretation that we inherit in the language, and that we make sense of the world always together. Even if we're writing, by ourselves, we're in conversation with the whole community of interlocutors. And unless we could enter into that sort of dialogue with ethical regard for one another, then we're kind of...
Yeah. Which is narcissistic, is solipsistic.
Right.
Or that's the worst. I guess that's the extreme.
Yeah, you end up with everyone having their own private conspiracy.
Or virtual world, or like synchronicities that are only about the self.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about synchronicity in the Jungian sense, and the way people usually experience and interpret them. They do seem somewhat solipsistic.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to communicate the significance of them to anyone else.
Well, they're internally related to the whole life, but I feel like there are some synchronicities, especially when there's a kind of awakening, and I think that's how Jung meant it, because I think he also said, like, it becomes banal eventually, but when you have been living shut off from that and you awaken to it, they always mention that example of the woman with the scarab beetle and the beetle up against the window, and it's like, I think that the fact that those can happen shows how personal the universe is, but also I guess shows how, like, totally alienated from the meaningfulness of life people are when it awakes them in a really personal way, I guess.
Yeah, it's like surprising to us when the psyche, the inner dimension, and the cosmos, the external world correspond. We're shocked. We're like, oh my God, because we're so not used to.
Well, yeah, we live in the prosaic world.
And it is a sacred connection and experience that should be not just like taken for granted, but at the same time,
it just depends, right? It just depends on what the context is. But the world is, I think these sort of Neoplatonic, Pythagorean, Hermetic vision of the cosmos is that, synchronicity is the principle of relatedness and the qualitative character of the universe. Inwardly related organism.
Yeah, everything breathes together, like Plotinus said.
Yeah.
And yet we also seem capable of alienation and isolation, and really experiencing ourselves as cut off from any cosmic ground of meaning. And I think that's the source of this whole dilemma of, like, how do we know what's true, and historical situatedness as a kind of functioning as a kind of pessimism when it comes to our capacity to know anything at all, and the reduction of knowledge claims to power plays, and the suspicion that gets directed out at everything and everyone seems like it follows from this alienation. And that's an unethical way of relating to one another and to reality, right?
Yeah, well, and to our forebears as well.
And it's not like just being totally gullible would be more ethical. Like, obviously, that's not the point. But
to have a kind of, imaginative receptivity.
Yeah, or should be responsible to one another.
Yes.
And, like, hermeneutics of charity, balancing our suspicion and our critical reflection on, both what we perceive and what we hear from others, but not so critical that we become incapable of shifting our own reference frame.
Oh. Trying to get the lizard.
So we need to be able to, Steiner talks about different worldviews. How being human is really more about finding ways to balance our participation in different worldviews, and not just become fixed in one. You can see the value in the others. And what does he say? A worldview only becomes false when it takes itself for the whole of the truth instead of a truth. I've heard some say, Steiner included, but also like Sean Gebser, that this is why we need to kind of go beyond philosophy. Heidegger says this in his own way.
That's what William Irwin Thompson was seeming to say too.
Yeah.
Wissenkunst. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah. Science art. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. I like philosophy, so I'm not ready to just...
I don't think
it depends. If you define philosophy as like trying to arrive at a complete, certain set of system of propositions that, gives you access to the true essence of being, that's dead.
Well, philosophy has reinvented itself throughout, its history, so it doesn't seem like it's over. That's something that was interesting to me, starting to read philosophy, was to hear about all these philosophers in the 20th century talking about the end of philosophy.
You're like, I'm just starting.
Yeah.
What do you mean it's over already?
Yeah,
I'm late to the party. Damn it.
Well, and also like you're kind of like, especially when you've read some more contemporary stuff that's like kind of forward looking, especially evolution of consciousness and things like that, and then you read the stuff about the end of philosophy. It's just a really interesting juxtaposition. But that, I guess, is the sort of like, return of the meta-narrative out of the all of that.
Did the meta-narrative ever leave?
Well, I guess it didn't. Yeah, because even the idea that there's no meta-narrative is a meta-narrative, and that's not necessarily the ultimate claim of, what's called postmodernism or deconstruction. Just to say that there's no meta-narratives. But
yeah, it's a meta-narrative that elides itself.
Or that is, as we were describing earlier, like one where you can't ignore the context. It's not, we can't have a view from nowhere philosophy anymore. Or one that assumes itself to be so, I guess. That's the way to put it.
Right. Yeah, is it helpful here to construe reality as a plurality of views on views?
Well, I guess if it's construed as a unity and multeity, right? Like,
oh yeah, the many are always becoming one. Each view is this vector of concrescence of many becoming one, but that multiplicity never gets finally resolved into
it's living,
a final
it's life
one. So doing philosophy in this situation really does mean like you overcome the theory practice divide. I guess you also overcome the fact value is ought divide, because every moment of your experience is the achievement of one of these views, one of these perspectives. and you achieve it as the result of valuing some way of growing the many together into one. And you leave this trail of achievements, of views behind you. We call those facts. But each one is the expression of an achievement of a value.
Mm-hmm. There's some deer.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, actuality is itself the achievement of value experience, the way Whitehead puts it. And we ourselves, as actors, participate in, obviously, the extent to which the world gets valued in different ways. That's because we're valuing it. But in so doing, by valuing it in different ways, that expression of a value is an accretion. It accumulates in the course of the evolution of consciousness, and that's what evolution is the accretion of these value decisions, these acts that become facts.
So how does Whitehead, how would you describe the relationship between value and, is it called the primordial whole, right? Or primordial eternal objects?
Yeah, God's primordial envisagement of the realm of eternal objects.
Yeah. How's that connect? How is that? Yeah, I'm curious about value in relation
God
to
is
that.
Rather than the creator of the world, creator of the world, God is the valuer of possibilities, and every other creature, God is a creature in Whitehead's view of creativity, but God is like the capital V valuer of possibility, and every creature cannot but receive God's primordial valuation of possibility as the matter out of which it makes itself. But it's just matter, it's not the form. It decides on its own form. But the matter is like the potentia that God unveils or reveals through that primordial valuation. And all of our experience is filtered through that array of possibilities, arrayed, according to the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those are, for us, given, even though primordially they were an act, a free deed by the divine. We receive them as given gifts. And so our values are always responsive to the value that God gave as a potential, and we inherit that.
So how is this different from, isn't it is it Aquinas or maybe even Aristotle, that God is existence and actuality? Is that right?
Essence, existence, and essence.
Oh yes, yeah. Is that
Aristotle says God is pure act.
Is there continuity in Whitehead?
No, I mean in some ways, but Thomas Aquinas says God is pure actual. God is pure act. God, there's nothing potential in God. Nothing remains possible or is held in reserve. It's all there.
Which God?
Aquinas.
Okay. Yeah, it's just like a fullness, right?
And Whitehead's saying that God is possibility. I mean, he's more like Cusa, Nicholas of Cusa, who says God is posse ipsum, or possibility itself. Which is it's like the negative theological tradition has this way of contradicting the orthodox cataphatic.
But is Aquinas, where is potential in Aquinas? If it's not like a kind of coming from the essence and existence coinciding.
It's in materiality, and he does give. He's a Aristotelian, right? And he gives the body and materiality this
Sacramental.
role. Yeah, it has this role to play. He's an incarnational thinker. So Aquinas is he's still participatory.
Yeah.
And he's not, even though there's no passivity in God, which is a problem Whitehead wants to resolve, there's still a way in which the passivity of the human body is valued by God. Like, that, why else incarnate? Why else would God become flesh unless by taking on the material something was achieved that couldn't otherwise have been achieved? But it's just this question of, for Whitehead, like, is there a consequent nature of God? Is there a way in which God receives us? That our love for God is Whitehead ultimately says that in some way, that he says the power of God is the worship God inspires,
Mm-hmm.
and that our love for God is like feeding the divine, such that God is in a position of needing something from creatures. And like Whitehead's God is not, the primordial nature of God is not conscious. It's only conscious after coming into relationship with the world, by passing through finitude,
Mm-hmm.
becoming individualized and dying and all of that.
So, Whitehead, you could say, he's in the Platonist lineage, but as well, Pythagorean, right? Would you say?
Is anyone not?
Well, no. I mean, I don't know if anyone's not.
You could be anti-Platonist, but you're still, it's like atheists are still in the theological tradition.
I guess I only prefaced with that because for me, like, maybe this is incorrect.
I mean, I'm just joking, really,
but,
of course.
Yeah. But I was thinking of, like,
Not everyone's a Platonist.
the Pythagorean sort of the relatedness of the powers or the numbers, like, that with the monad we having a kind of resemblance or a correspondence with the sort of the character of the primordial pole and creativity with the dyad, and then God's act of creation, the valuation as like the link between them, the triad. And thinking in a triune way. Yeah. I mean, I think there is a Trinity going on here with the primordial nature of God, the finite occasions of the temporal process, and then the consequent nature of God. That's that three-way relationship. It's also cyclical, though, so you could almost say it's a quaternity because there's a repetition. Yeah, all the numbers kind of flare forth from that.
Yeah.
That perichoresis.
Yeah.
I think mythopoetically, I think, there's many ways to express this, but like the dyad and the goddess, like I think of Catherine Keller and like the face of the deep and the Tiamat. Sure. Want to turn around?
Yeah. The Tehom. In Genesis. Where are you going with that?
Well, just that when we can imagine and think, philosophy in connection with the imaginal, that has an archetypal character to realize how philosophy has grown out of that and should, I think, in its new incarnation, be able to perceive it once again and connect philosophy with it. That she's doing that when she, thematizes that, because it's also like a reflection of our cultural context, because with the feminist movement and the need for philosophy to like reflect that as well, and this whole inheritance of the Pythagorean Platonic philosophy out of the mythic origins.
I'm interested to talk more about the feminist aspect because, Plato's been and Platonism so critiqued for being the wrong kind of transcendence or dualism or masculinist,
or misinterpreted,
misogynist, but actually putting Plato in his historical context and reading what he says in the Republic about women and their capacity to be guardians, leaders, because of the fact that they have rational soul. Well, that's what guardians are.
Okay.
They have rationality just like men. And that's pretty notable as a position in Plato's time and place. And you could say the feminist movement in some ways is seated there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's why, like, Steiner he's consistent in his Platonism, because it's very clear in the philosophy of freedom, in that way, but it's not even presented in a parable, or not a parable, but whatever we would call the imagination of the Republic.
Yeah.
It had become more of a reality by that time.
It's interesting, like, metaphor of the cave in this context and the birth process, the cave as the womb. Because Plato does also say that it's not just about escaping one individual, liberating themselves from the chains and crawling up to the light, being reborn, but coming back. I mean, that's what Socrates is a kind of, it's like the platonic bodhisattva who returns to liberate others. And that takes skillful means, that's like engaging in philosophy in the way Socrates did, as a kind of working as a wet nurse or the
nursemaid. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the Timaeus. He's different.
Well, Plato talks about, or Timaeus, the astronomer, in the dialogue talks about the receptacle as a kind of wet nurse, but Socrates is helping with the birth process. I'm blanking on the word I'm looking for, but midwifing, thank you. And so philosophy is a midwifing practice. I mean, it's practice for dying. It's a practice of teaching others to die as oneself prepares for dying, and like being hospitable to one another, like recognizing that we're all in this together.
Yeah.
Reality is a form of togetherness, not a monad, not just a chaos of separate particulars.
Or opposition, the war of all against all.
Right. It is a togetherness.
You need that third.
A nexus of some kind. And we all dwell together. We're passing into and out of each other. We make each other biologically, but also ontologically. And it's so easy to become blind to that, because we fall into this trap of like game theory where we're like, well, if the other person doesn't think of it that way, then I can't trust them, and so I have to protect me and mine. And then the history's off and running, and like the war of all against all is just inevitable, because we're all failing to participate faithfully, because we're afraid. I mean, I get it. It's just tragic, The fearfulness and the sin, I guess, that's what sin is, I guess, to use a biblical concept or way of thinking about this, because
Mm-hmm.
what is the fall but a kind of falling out of synchrony?
Obscured vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful.
But Felix Culpa, right?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, no freedom,
What was her
no
name?
love.
Shirley Sugarman wrote a book called Narcissus and... what was it? It's about the evolution of consciousness and sin. Sorry, sin.
Yeah.
Duh. It's so good. It's about this sort of changing relationship to that theme.
Yeah.
She thinks with Barfield, among many others, in there.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays this concept, obviously, with secular people and progressives and stuff, has
Sin, yeah.
fallen out of favor, or worse, been kind of demonized as like the reason society is so fractured is that we still have this religious idea and we don't just accept individual freedom, but we still have a concept of sin here in this secular nominalist freedom-loving age, and it's to sin now is to not permit, to not be permissive.
Yeah, there's also a distortion. You could say we have a distorted perception of sin because of a new kind of, there's that, but there's also this medical paradigm where, like, the ideal is a kind of vague well-being or health, and if you have any kind of pathology, then that is like the sin.
But aren't we another turn of the dialectical wheel beyond that already? I mean, yes, there's lots of that.
Maybe we are.
But there's also
now, I guess. I don't think it's completely resolved.
There's there's the critique of ableism and the neurally divergent sort of movement away from that whole medicalized idea and like not pathologizing Asperger's or autism or whatever diagnostic label we want to use, but saying, no, this is just another way of being human. And so it's permissiveness, right? It's always our proper. There is no proper way.
I don't think everybody thinks that way about it.
No, not everybody. I'm just saying that's a major movement emerging in critique of what you were describing.
Yeah, well, and it is, as you said, against a sort of nihilistic background often, where there's no moral sources, in Charles Taylor's language, and so there's also a kind of relativization of morality.
But there is a moral source. It's individual feeling and pleasure and hedonics, right? It is a moral source. It's a kind of Epicureanism or something.
Yeah, I think, and again, to draw on Charles Taylor, he will talk about different goods. And there's competing goods, and then there's hypergoods. And I think there's a connection between hypergoods and moral sources. I don't know if I would say the hedonic principle is a moral source. I don't know if I would say that. But it is definitely, like, a good, But, like, how... I think the question becomes, like, when there's a hypergood, which is, like, the kind of axial introduction, there's a kind of transcendent reference point for, quote-unquote, lower goods that you don't want to completely dispense with, but or that just are reprioritized. That's the potential, or at least if you recognize a hypergood, as he calls it. But not everyone does, so that's kind of the conversation.
So, pleasure is definitely not, or happiness, maybe, to use a slightly less...
And what is that index
pejorative term?
Yeah.
It's not a hypergood, but how do we restore comportment to a hypergood, or I guess the hypergood, without it becoming totalizing and...
Or like a false asceticism.
Negating all of the mini-goods.
No, I think that's such an important question. I feel like that's what a lot of people who are seekers of any kind, whether, in philosophy or, not necessarily in philosophy, like contemporary people, especially Americans, but I think anybody in a industrialized or post-industrial, whatever you want to call it, a cultural context where pleasure is just so accessible and encouraged, like how to, because a lot of times I'll like I've come, and I think this is kind of true to some extent in Steiner, like it's really ambiguous. It's almost like you really shouldn't like prioritize pleasure because it's egotistical and it will just you will devolve. That's the basic but that's not to say you shouldn't enjoy pleasures when they happen, but that they shouldn't be like the primary ordering principle in your life. But it's complicated, right? Like, because otherwise your life is like basic. I mean, and this is just maybe just me reading into it, but there's a kind of, I guess, a Protestantism to it, a kind of austere, like work, and your fruit shall come from your good works. So shut up and do good works. That's extreme, but
Well, what is our freedom for? What is our
I think if life were more artistic, maybe it I wouldn't have that reaction, and many others wouldn't have that reaction. If the life wasn't so, if work didn't have this kind of prosaic, like alienated.
Well, maybe the point is we're not just here to enjoy ourselves.
Yeah.
We're here to
produce value together and
to be joyous together.
Yeah. That really comes through in his economic perspective. Like the ideal is that we eventually come to feel a kind of joy in the fact that we are producing for others and that others are producing for us. I mean, that sounds like a beehive.
Yeah, but unlike beehives, human hives foster individual freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but we don't have
the group mind.
Yeah, but because we all have a unique task in the context of the hive, where there's a differentiation of labor that is appropriate, so long as no one's being exploited. Because if everyone benefits from the profits afforded by a differentiation of labor, then everyone's like, we're all lifting each other up, like leveling up the exchange through the exchange of energy in this highly complex, self-organizing way, global marketplace. Like if we did that without the egotistical
expectation
accumulation of private profits, but we used all of the profit produced by this market economy to feed back into culture creation. I mean, culture creation, but also just making sure everyone's physical needs are taken care of, first of all. And then culture creation, like, we'd live such meaningful lives, first of all, because we'd be feeding meaning-making itself instead of feeding just this egotistical desire for personal advance, money, and power.
That would be cool.
Yeah, and so what's preventing it? Like this fear, right? This distrust.
It takes a lot of
suspicion.
First, it takes some kind of. It takes so much. I mean, but as you're describing, it takes a kind of vulnerability and courage and also like very contextual, like arrangements and agreements, and it's very concrete.
Yeah.
These are, we're kind of abstractly reflecting on the potential, but it would have to like be brought into concrete circumstances, like food, food production, and it's so interesting. Like I feel like William Irwin Thompson kind of gets at this in his like vision of the future as like, what does he say, like miniaturized technologies and people living more like
meta-industrial villages.
Yeah, exactly. And that there's like it would be planetary interconnection so it's like
federation.
So like you don't like lose out necessarily like from what you are given in the urban development, that there's something that arises like the noosphere, that maintains that connection. But how like art transforms, I mean, I guess it kind of moves into the noospheric medium, the metaverse.
Yeah, I think the idea is like planetize and localize at the same time as part of the same transversal, almost lemniscate-like movement.
Yeah.
So meta-industrial village is like 3D printing, and all of your food, or as much as possible, grown locally.
Yeah.
And even most of the products that you need produced locally, manufactured as local, but you're going to need to have some trade at that level. But you try to localize production as much as possible, and you planetize information flows.
Mm-hmm.
And you maintain local culture through the culture of production of material goods and food, agriculture, right? But you create this planetary culture at the same time at the level of what is shared digitally, electronically. And so you're living in two worlds at once, in a way. I mean, we're living in many worlds at once. There is the Earth and the planet and a sense of planetary consciousness, but there's also each unique locality contributing what only it can contribute.
Yeah, I think we're in a kind of frenetic schizo phase, right now, with the relationship between the local and the globally interconnected. There's the global is really, I think, impacting the local and not respecting its integrity,
Right.
as in a whole within a whole. And so that's what I feel like is really needed with the internet and the kind of, the transformation of that medium. It needs to be more harmonic.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that won't happen anytime soon. I don't know.
Well, it just needs to be more decentralized instead of corporate social media platforms. More of a truly networked approach, so that there is no question of free speech, because there's no big cop that can control
centralized
who gets to see what, when, and how. Right? People have the freedom to become part of the networks that they want to become part of. And information flows without being impeded. Now, this, again, there's a trust dimension to this, because, people might say, well, we need the government to regulate the information flow, because what if there are conspiracies, and what if there's false information, propaganda, etc. And it's well, that's always going to be a problem, or there's always going to be the threat of that. But until we live and let live and truly accept, allow people to be adults about their information hygiene, their digital hygiene, and we treat everyone like babies, we have to regulate the truth, and because as soon as you do that, the regulators become biased and their truth is limited too. So I think we just have to either give up the human project or have faith in individual human beings to be able to pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful freely without the need for
compulsory.
Yeah. Government control or micromanagement.
Cypherpunk. You need encryption.
But I do think we have this issue of giant corporations who have been given legal personhood, and it's hard for individual people to compete. And so maybe what needs to happen is that we just co-opt the corporate model. In other words, through human associations, we forge a resistance to those corporations that are seeking profit motive only.
That's why encryption, I think, and the whole cypherpunk privacy in cyberspace is really essential, because the powers that be exercise a lot of power.
Well, it's
and
privacy
are not interested
from corporations and government, but being public in the commons for culture creation.
Yeah, I think it's more. It's not that everything would necessarily be private, but that what we want to be private can be private.
Yeah.
Transactions or what have you. You know.
Yeah, the
So
stuff
that
governments would spy on and corporations would harvest as our private data.
Yeah, to sort of pull us into, because that's the kind of scary potential, right? Of like the increasing, digitization of currency, like with the RegFi, like there being an even more intense surveillance state. Yeah. I mean, we're already very intensely surveilled, but we're not necessarily, I mean, most people, I guess, aren't like, there aren't repercussions, or, there aren't any kind of, I guess, exploitative, well, no, there are exploitative developments arising from that surveillance, but you know what I mean? Like, people aren't, like, there's still a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
But who knows? I've tuned in for some of these like videos about like new AI developments coming out, and like there's this work that's being done on, the mind reading, and I think that's just like why would we try to develop that?
I mean, that's already what social media algorithms are harvesting.
Yeah.
Is that they're building models of each one of us to predict our future.
Well, but
actions.
like just the imaging, like trying to translate what people are thinking into images that match what they're thinking.
Yeah.
That's what I'm referencing. Like that's a kind of good like is ought case.
Yeah, like for example, that song's probably going to trigger a copyright infringement on YouTube. Maybe it might, and because
that's crazy.
The owner of the song doesn't, it all goes back to this private property, profit thing. And I'm not trying to say there should be no profit. It's just like what happens to those profits, and so we need to fight back against the corporate harvest of data for profit, because we end up being the product that they're selling instead of a real producer or creator of the content, which we want to think of ourselves as. But so long as we're doing it on these corporate platforms, they're harvesting the value monetarily. I mean, they share some revenue, I know, with some people, but like they're still harvesting way more than they're creating relative to what all the content creators are creating. So we need to make that more fair, some economic justice there. And to that extent, crypto, I think, does have, and blockchain has a role to play, but like, how do you institute that?
Yeah.
With all this power centralized in archaic constitutional order, in an archaic constitutional order that's like totally inadequate to the current historical situation. Because like if we tried to spontaneously like do some kind of anarchist mutual aid lateral power system, like the government would literally treat us as criminals and violently suppress it.
Yeah.
If we went too far with it, at least. Like, oh, why would we pay taxes? We don't need your roads. We built our own. Like, they'd be like, no, you can't opt out. Sorry.
Yep. Thus the value of choosing when your transactions or what have you are encrypted or not.
Yeah. The point is not like, I'm not anti-tax, like paying into
it's more
for social
who's
needs.
deciding the taxation, that's really like, is it...
Well, and who decides what we spend it on? Like,
what's it for? Yeah, all that. It should be arising out of the community. not like in this alienated form.
Right. So much of the federal budget is for cronyism, for lining the pockets of
My God, it's
the
absurd.
Congress directly, but also all the people that they're friends with, the lobbyists, and it's all... The federal budget is designed to serve capital instead of the people.
Yeah.
That seems to me an irrefutable claim. When you just look at the expenditures and...
It's gonna explode.
Yeah, and it's a volatile thing, and there's political forces vying for control that, need to be resisted, and so we form alliances, and I'm not suggesting we just... If the federal system is broken, it doesn't mean stop participating in it totally, because we need a controlled demolition here, I think.
Or a transformation.
I mean, maybe we won't get the option for a controlled demolition,
I like transformation better.
Yeah. But when has world history ever unfolded with so much consciousness and conscientious? It just explodes at some point, and you get war. That's a scary prospect.
Yeah.
Tragic, all of it. But there's hope, because this is a pattern that's written deep in the historical process, and we're still here despite multiple phase transitions in the human past, where there was this interim of chaos and violence.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful to review that, in human history, but also in what we can conjecture about evolution of a life on Earth before humans.
Yeah, I mean, evolution proceeds by catastrophe, not a steady continuity or continuous, gradual process. It's massive disruptions actually catalyze creative responses. And catalyze complexity and deeper consciousness. Until it breaks, you don't know what it's until you've lost something, you don't fully appreciate it.